So thank you everybody for dialing in today. I'm going to be talking about the new AWS European Sovereign Cloud, but also more broadly about things like digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, and so forth. So if you're not using AWS as it currently stands, there'll still be some more general takeaways that you can incorporate into what you're doing. A little bit about me. So I'm Mike, and I'm Chief Product and Technology Officer at the Scale Factory. We're an advanced AWS consulting partner and work across various projects like migrations, AI, data engineering, and so forth. I see that many of the people dialed in today are already familiar with us and have worked with us in the past, so that's great to see, but also some new faces. So let's get started. I've got on an agenda for today to give you an idea of what we'll be covering. So first off, I'll be talking about sovereignty, what and why, to bring everybody's sort of understanding up to the same kind of baseline. And there's a lot of general concepts that you can take away, even if you are not using AWS as it stands today. I'll then be talking about what AWS sovereignty looks like today, or as of the end of last year, before the new sovereign cloud was launched. We'll take a look at the AWS European Sovereign Cloud, what that means, whether it makes sense for you to use it. If you do need to make use of it, what the challenges might be. I've got a few tips and tricks there for you, and that leads into the sort of implications for builders. So if you are building infrastructure on AWS, what does AWS European Sovereign Cloud actually look like? And is there anything you need to consider as part of that? Throughout today, do feel free to ask questions. You'll find a Q&A button somewhere on your screen, either at the top or the bottom, depending on which client you're using or whether you're in the browser. If you click on that, you can ask some questions. And at the end, I'll go through those questions if we have time and answer those. But do feel free to make use of the chat as well throughout. So to get started, I'm going to ask everyone on this call one question, and I want you to hold this thought, write it down on a post-it or make a note of it somewhere. And that is, who controls your data in the cloud today? So if we get to the end of today's session and the thing that you've learned is the European Sovereign Cloud is not something that you need to consider or make use of today, having the answer to this question is still super useful, because it might come up in your organization at some point. Somebody internally might ask you, a prospective customer might ask your current customer. So have a little bit of a think about this, make a note of it. And if you don't have the answer, go away and try and find out, ask some people in your team. So who controls your data in the cloud today? Hold that thought. So sovereignty, what and why? Let's have a look on what this means and why it's important. So here's a dictionary definition of sovereignty. And the thing that I wanted to highlight here was freedom from external control, autonomy. So that's the main thing that we're picking out and highlighting and focusing on today. And most of the discussions around digital or data sovereignty are essentially freedom from external control. So that's the main point that I want you to take away. And if we have a look at this in practice, what does that mean? So this is a little bit contrived and a complex example, but I'm hoping this illustrates the point. And you can go through this activity with the sort of lens of your own organization. So imagine you have a UK company operating under a .io domain. The users of the system are in Hong Kong, and you have picked the Paris AWS region to host your platform. And that so happens to be Amazon Web Services, which is a US-owned cloud vendor. So you can see actually why this gets quite complex. When you ask the question of who owns what and who is responsible for, the data or digital sovereignty, where does that sit? It actually gets quite complicated, or can get quite complicated. So, thinking about who controls your platform, who has technical access to data, who has legal access to data or legal jurisdiction, So having to think about that. So you can see actually why this is quite complicated here, and why this is coming up more in like increasingly in conversations, and becoming more important for organizations. So if we have a look at data sovereignty, this is about the way I like to think about this is more about legal jurisdiction. So it's not just geography. So thinking about the legal jurisdiction of data. And data, generally speaking, is subject to the laws of the country or region where it's stored and processed. It determines which authorities can access and regulate it. So, for example, legally, data in Germany is governed by German and EU law. So that's where it stands. So if you're hosting data in the Frankfurt AWS region, that data is governed by German and EU law. So it's important to remember that. So that's data sovereignty. And then if we have a look at operational sovereignty, this essentially extends the control beyond where the data sits to who can touch or move or interact with that data. So this ensures that only authorized in-region personnel can manage workloads and data. And it covers things, so operational sovereignty covers things like access controls, admin roles, key management, so certificates, access keys, encryption, token certificates, and monitoring, and so on. So this is all about identity, access management, and who can access what and who can control what. And then if we look at digital sovereignty, this is more of an umbrella concept, and it depends on this depends on both the operational and data sovereignty being in place. So if you think about the data sovereignty, once you've got that clear, and then you look at the operational sovereignty, this sits across the two. So you have to sort of work in that order, essentially. And this is basically the freedom and capability to run digital systems securely under your own rules, and considering things like data, operations, infrastructure, and governance. And if you look at the sort of movement within Europe, within the EU, it's a key policy goal for digital autonomy. So a lot of organizations, a lot of countries are sort of focusing on and looking at digital sovereignty, but underneath that, you need to consider operational and data sovereignty as parts of that. So where is your data stored? What access controls in place? Who has access to it? Who can process data, and so forth? So that's just a kind of whistle stop of digital sovereignty and what that means. And hopefully that sets the scene and gives everybody a bit of an understanding for what sovereignty in AWS looks like today. As I mentioned at the start, this broadly will apply to other cloud platforms. A lot of them are set up in the same way. A lot of the big hyperscalers are very US centric. So, GCP, Azure, and AWS are all pretty similar, but so you can carry these kind of concepts and thinking across. So let's have a look at AWS's sovereignty pledge as it stands today. So if you're running a platform on AWS, there are a number of features that are made available to support you in achieving your goals around sovereignty. I'll go into a bit more detail on what features there are available, what you can make use of in hitting your objectives. And there is actually a AWS blog that's available that spells out their sovereignty pledge. We'll I think at the end in one of the resources that we'll follow up with, we've got a link to that blog, and you can, if this is something that's important to you, you can have a read of that and see if that aligns with your organization's needs. But yeah, so AWS's pledge is you have control over the location of your data. You can control who has access to that data. You've got the ability to encrypt everything, everywhere, and they give some guarantees around the resiliency of the cloud and the availability of your data. So that's the sort of the TLDR of AWS's blog posts on their pledge. So talking about regions, so AWS has a pretty expansive footprint and locations in all of the major regions. So availability zones where you can store your data. Obviously, this is a key part of your digital sovereignty. So you can see here the sort of North and South American, Europe, you've got Africa, Middle East, Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and there are multiple locations within that. So there are plenty of options, almost too many options. It can make it a bit confusing about where you can store your data or store your end customers' data. So they make it possible for you to do that. The other thing to touch upon is the hardware and how AWS have essentially built those data centers. So the infrastructure that sits within them, Amazon have developed their own hardware platform, Nitro, which underpins the whole cloud platform, and it controls access to storage and networking with almost, it's not an air gap, but there is a degree of separation between where data is stored and processed versus their control plane. So AWS can, people within AWS can operate the infrastructure and operate that control plane. But there is no mechanism for them to gain access to those Nitro hosts, to access memory or access customer data. And they've had this verified by third parties. It's something that they've put a lot of investment in to have that degree of separation so that data can be stored and processed in a geographical region, and AWS can administer the hardware for that. And with this degree of separation, they can make guarantees that they're not interacting with or exposing or getting access to your data. So this is a key concept to hold. And then the next thing, this famous encrypt all the things meme, I had to put it on a slide somewhere. They provide you with the ability to encrypt everything. So encrypt everything at rest, in transit, or in memory. Most AWS encryption mechanisms available in most regions allow you to use customer managed keys that are inaccessible to AWS. So you can provide your own key material that AWS cannot access, and you can use that to encrypt data. And you can also use keys that are stored outside of AWS cloud for the highest level of protection. But as you might imagine, that will be the most complex and costly setup that you can have. But if it is a requirement for your organization, that is available. So to bring all these things together, essentially, sovereignty is about risk management. So if you're thinking about, okay, what if this is relevant and what if this is important to my organization, this is the key thing to remember. It's likely for your organization, sovereignty is about managing risk, and different use cases, different platforms, different organizations using cloud platforms have different risk appetites. So you have to consider the sort of risk level within your organization and apply that to this as well. If we have a look at the sovereignty risk with AWS as it stands, or as it stood at the end of 25, the most obvious thing here is that AWS is very tied to the USA. And I'm not going to pivot the webinar today and start diving into politics, but obviously politics has the political climate has a big impact on this, right? And I think this is why this is at the front of everybody's mind as it currently stands. So the infrastructure is owned and operated by a US company. The identity, and this is a key thing here, right? So let's say we have some data and we store that in the Paris region for some French customers, some French end users. The data will stay within that region. It won't leave that region, but billing metadata and identity metadata does leave that region. So it's not the data itself, but it's metadata about access to the data and what costs have been incurred for storing that data, leaves that region and is transferred and processed in Virginia, so US East 1, which is the sort of default global region for AWS. And the other thing to bear in mind here is that the roots of trust are US based. So any certificates that AWS provide, so if you use any of their encryption mechanisms and so forth, the roots of trust of those certificates go all the way back to, you can trace them back to the US. So this is the key thing as it stands for, I guess, the conventional AWS regions. So even if you're storing data in Paris or Frankfurt or London or Dublin, this applies. Talked about risk here. Spoiler, this level of risk is unacceptable to certain organizations. So, you know, if you're, let's say you're developing software and you're selling that to a European government entity or a non-US government entity, then your buyer might have some concerns around this and may want some degree of separation or some degree of assurance around this. So, you know, if you're using one of the regular AWS commercial regions as it stands today, this might be absolutely fine, depending on your risk profile and your customer's risk profile. But as I said, some organizations do need to rethink this. If the infrastructure or the software that you're running is considered critical national infrastructure, then you may want to consider the new European sovereign cloud, if that's applicable. Have a look at EU compliance regimes, look at legislation within the companies that you're storing and processing data and so on. It might be that for that particular workload, an AWS commercial region might not be possible. And as I mentioned, like, you know, the political climate is shifting. So this is something that may shift over time. So it might be okay today, but in a few years' time, the sort of appetite for risk here might shift in the other direction. So let's not talk about AWS for 1 second or a few seconds and look at some other EU cloud providers. So there's quite a good, there's a source at the bottom here. We will be sharing these slides, by the way. So if there's any links and things here that you find useful, you will get a copy of this afterwards. So if you think you might fall into this category, then there are a growing, increasing number of EU native cloud providers. So OVH, Scaleway are probably the most kind of popular or most likely ones that you've heard of. They're all based in the EU, and they've got, I guess, if you compare them with the hyperscalers, their feature set is much more limited. So they don't have all of the services that are available as, you know, say AWS or Azure. But, you know, you've got all of the things that you would expect: some way of storing data, some sort of blob storage, some way of running compute, and some kind of database offering as well. You know, these are options. So, you know, they are available. But what we see is there are some complexities here. So let's say, for example, you're building a cloud platform team and you are looking at hiring out people with certain skills. It's quite easy to put up a job ad and hire some AWS engineers or some Azure engineers. A little trickier to find people out there who have skills with architecting a, you know, really robust, rock solid platform running on OVH or Scaleway. So the sort of experience isn't quite so wide out there. You know, there are, as I said, there are fewer features, fewer, you know, regions and locations available as well. So it's quite limited, but there are options. Now this is where AWS European Sovereign Cloud comes in. So AWS recognized I guess a gap in the market or a need to provide customers with a greater degree of control over sovereignty for customers in the EU, whilst having access to, you know, the same kind of feature set available on the rest of the AWS cloud. Your skills are transferable and all of that. So they recognized a need in the market. Now, AWS European Sovereign Cloud was due to be launched in December last year. There was a slight delay on that, and it was launched last month. So it is live and it is available at the time of this recording. This page, this is the sort of landing page for the European Sovereign Cloud, where you can find out some more information and sort of drill down into details. There is a link to this in the slides later on that I'll come back to. So let's have a look at what this region looks like. So here is the operating model. So AWS are running the European Sovereign Cloud entirely in the EU, using entirely employees resident in the EU. The parent company is a German-based limited company, and the European sovereign cloud is owned by that dedicated, and this is a parent company. So, so there is a separation from the US entity of AWS. The leadership within that company is held exclusively by EU citizens. The advisory board are all EU citizens. Um, all of the operations, the support, customer service, every interaction that you will have with somebody at AWS will be provided by EU citizens residing in the EU and all subject to EU law. The root certificate authority is based in the EU. So it's not tied back to the US entity or a US artifact or system. It's worth noting here that whilst all of this here stands, the technology and software is provided by the US parent company. So it probably doesn't remove all of the risk here, but what this does allow you to do is move slightly more into the world of having the sort of degree of separation from the US entity than you would do otherwise. But yeah, there's still this kind of little, there is still has to be that little tie back to the US entity. I'm not quite sure how it works. I don't think AWS have disclosed this. Maybe the US parent company leases the rights to the software and the technology to the German entity. I'm not too sure. But there is quite a degree of separation here. The other thing to touch on here is pricing and billing. So if you're familiar with AWS, with the standard commercial regions as it stands today, even if it doesn't matter what region you're based in or what you pick, by default, AWS operates in US dollars. You might opt to have AWS bill you in another currency, but they do a currency conversion at the end of the month. Key difference here is the AWS Sovereign Cloud will operate entirely in euros. So everything will be processed in euros by default. I think you can still opt to have to be billed in another currency, but it will be a conversion from euros to your currency of choice at the end of the month, as opposed to US dollars to that. You'll be billed from an EU entity. I think AWS does bill customers residing in the EU from an EU entity as it currently stands. I know that we receive our AWS bills from an entity in Luxembourg or something like that. So it isn't a major shift, but you're going to receive your bills from an EU entity. And it's more expensive than the Frankfurt commercial region. I did some crunching on the pricing to give you all an idea. It looks like it's between about 10 to 15% more expensive than Frankfurt. So I had a look at EC2 pricing, some other compute options in S3, and it sort of falls within that by ballpark. So you are going to pay a little bit of a premium for this, but it's not massive in the grand scheme of things. At the bottom of this slide, there is a pricing calculator specific for that region as well. So if you use the AWS pricing calculator, there is a different link. I think it is literally you just add .eu at the end, if I recall from memory, and that will bring up the pricing calculator for this region, and then you can plumb in, all of the services that you might use, and you can do a cost comparison. I'll drill into this a bit more on the next slide to give you a bit of a visual, because if this is something that you're not familiar with, it takes a little bit to get your head around. But if you're interacting with AWS with infrastructure as code or APIs, in effect, what Amazon have done is created a European partition. So on the next slide, I've got a visual to explain this, but if you've ever worked with GovCloud or AWS China, it's a similar model. It's completely separated and segregated. So the first European Sovereign Cloud region is in Brandenburg in Germany. There are plans to open up other regions as well, but this is the first one. I'm not sure what the timeframes are on the other regions coming, but Amazon have made a pledge to invest 7.8 billion in building those new data centers and regions. One thing that I touched on earlier was about billing and identity data, like things like audit logs being shipped off to Virginia for processing and storage. These are going to be held locally. So I imagine Brandenburg will become the default region. It will be the US East one of European Sovereign Cloud. And all of the IAM and billing data we process there, so it will remain within the EU. And the key thing to touch on here is that the architecture is going to be familiar, the services will be familiar, and the APIs will be familiar. So if you've worked with another commercial AWS region, you'll be able to transfer those skills and technologies across. So let's have a look at what this partition looks like in a little bit more detail in practice. So hopefully this gives you a kind of visual. So if you, as I said, if you work with AWS China or GovCloud, it looks like this. So let's say you work with AWS and you've just worked with the standard commercial regions as it stands today. You probably notice in resource naming, the sort of the prefix with AWS, and that's the partition. And if you looked at that, you probably thought, oh, well, that doesn't make sense. All of this is AWS, but that's there so that you can, it gives the ability to work with resources in other partitions. So if you were creating a resource and you needed to reference something else, instead of using AWS, it would become AWS-CN if you're operating with AWS China, and that's because it's a distinct partition. And as you can see here on the far right of the slide, the European Sovereign Cloud, the partition name is AWS-EUSC for EU Sovereign Cloud. And the region name, I put it there just to, I couldn't be bothered to go through all the other ones and add all the region names. So I've just done it for Brandenburg, but you can see that the region name is EUSC DE East 1. So you can see how they're sort of planning out the convention there for the other ones that are coming. Now, the important thing to note here is each of these partitions is a hard boundary. So within the platform, within AWS, you cannot transit across those. There are obviously ways of connecting them. You could set up a VPN, you could run some code in one to make some API calls with some access keys across to another. But as it stands, all of these are separated by a hard boundary. Each one has its own IAM security stack, own billing, own metering, and so on. So you can't create a user or a role in one, and then there's a hard boundary there. Obviously, it's possible to sort of bridge it by writing a bit of code or some scripts or a VPN and so forth, but they're designed with hard boundaries in mind. Cool. So Marco did mention something in the chat, and I provided a link actually. So I've got a link at the bottom of this this slide here, and yes, it is the same link. So here are the services that are available. So 90 services were made available out of the 240 available at launch. There's more to follow. I've included a screenshot here to give you an idea of what it looks like. So as you can see, AWS Config and AWS Control Tower are available today. AWS Code Deploy is coming Q2 26 and Code Pipeline 27 Q1. So if you absolutely need Code Pipeline for your workload, you're going to have to wait a year for it. One thing to bear in mind, these are always indicative, so these may move forward or back. It's just to give you an indication of when they might be available. The other thing to note here is AWS Marketplaces was separated as well. So, and that is available as well at launch. So let's say you use AWS today and you buy, I don't know, some security software through the marketplace, you'll have to procure that separately through the AWS Marketplace in EU Sovereign Cloud for your workloads running there. So that's an important distinction, and that's available at launch. I will come on to market. I will circle back to marketplace in a little bit because there are some things that you need to be aware of and watch out for when it comes to that. I'm not going to go through a list of all of the services available today, but all of the standard sort of table stake services are available. So compute, storage, database, security, networking features, all of those are available at launch. A lot of it is just the sort of higher level, more managed services that are available, and you can sort of see there's services that depend on other services being launched. Do click on that link, go and have a look and see if the ones that you absolutely need are available there or not. One thing to point out here is that AWS Bedrock is available out of the box. So you can see Amazon's got their priorities here. Bedrock is available in this region before Code Deploy and Code Pipeline, but I won't pass too much more comment on that. So implications for builders. Let's dig a little bit into the sort of detail here. So if you're an engineer or you're managing engineers and you're thinking you might have to build out some infrastructure in this region, what does this mean for you? Um, so for your business, it might open up a new customer market for you. If there are organizations that are thinking, okay, you know what, we're reviewing our SaaS tooling and we're going to move to SaaS offerings that are based in the EU. This might give you the edge. You might be able to run a version of your product in this region and open up a new market and say, we have, a European sovereign based, version of our software with a premium price tag of at least 10 to 15%, so that you've got your cost covered, and it might open up a new customer market there for you. So it might be beneficial. The one thing that I mentioned earlier is that if let's say you publish your software on the AWS marketplace, it won't be available in the European Software and Cloud Marketplace. If you want to make it available there, you will have to run a copy. You'd have to basically ensure that your software meets the criteria to be published on the AWS marketplace in the European Software and Cloud and publish it there accordingly. So do have a look at that. If you've got no requirement driving your organization in this direction today, definitely put this on your list, because if your end customers are going to launch stuff in European Software and Cloud region, and they purchase your software through the marketplace and you're not on the marketplace, they might have no option but to purchase a competitor's product instead. So hold that thought, bear that in mind. Might not be a massive risk, but as time goes by, the appetite for this might grow. As I mentioned, it's a entirely new partition. So today you might deploy your infrastructure across multiple commercial regions, and it might be as simple as adding another region identifier to your Terraform or your CloudFormation. That probably isn't going to work. Maybe not as smoothly as that. You need to consider that this is an entirely new partition. So you're going to have to set up a new landing zone, new identity and access management, new billing and cost infrastructure to manage your controls, your cost controls, and so on. Ensure that your infrastructure code is ported across and then that works. The other thing to bear in mind is if you just run your product here, you can go off and do that, but your own company's legal structure might not meet the running your software here isn't the full story. Basically, you might have to review your company's legal structure to make sure that you also have leadership, an entity with leadership and customer support and infrastructure engineers based in the EU that's subject to EU law. So if you're a US-based company, just spinning up infrastructure in this region isn't going to tick the box as far as end customers are concerned. You will have to effectively do what AWS has done here. And then the last thing on the list is double check the list of services. So the link I provided earlier, go have a look and see if the key services that you use are available there. The other thing to mention that I think is quite useful is AWS have just launched a digital sovereignty lens. So this is not just about EU sovereignty requirements. This is much more broader. So it can apply to almost any region that you're in. We've got early access to this lens. It's a lens that you load into the well-architected tool, and it extends the well-architected framework and brings in new questions for you to consider when you're thinking about your data, digital, operational sovereignty, and so forth. We can help you get set up with that. Provide you with a copy of the lens. I don't think there's a published date for it yet, so we can give you early access to it, and then walk you through that, take you through a couple of questions and so on. If that's something you're interested in, get in touch and let us know. You can just pop something in the chat, and then one of the team will follow up with you and get you set up with the lens. Cool. So that's all of the content. We've got some time for questions. We've got plenty of time for questions, actually. So let's have a look. So I had a question from Ian. Will the slides be shared afterwards? Daniel's already answered that. So yeah, we'll share a copy of the slides afterwards, and links to some of the resources I talked about. We have a question here. Are the defined Chinese wall governance between Are there defined Chinese wall governance between the US and EU entity? So I'm not sure when this question was answered, but earlier I was talking about the separate entity, the EU leadership, EU advisory board, all of the staff based in the EU, like a staffing, a complete segregated staffing, as well as infrastructure stuff. There is a white paper on this that does go into a bit more detail. So if you've got any specific questions about the separation, you want more insight into what that separation looks like in more detail, it is buried away in that white paper. So we'll share actually on I've got a slide just to round off with a QR code to download that. So go have a look in there because I think the answers you're looking for will be there. Have a question here, Danielle. Is the German parent company ultimately a subsidiary of the US grandparent company? I don't think so. I think it's a separate entity. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the relationship is between the two. I think there is a degree of separation between them, but I do think the US company has some sort of rights and investment in the German entity. So again, it's not a separate. You're not going to get, like, let's say OVH, which is run by a European entity, the sort of parent company and the full control is within the EU. There is still that connection back to the US. So have a look in that white paper and just see if that is acceptable, really. Another question here we've got: is there any advice you could give for taking existing infrastructure as code and running it in the new region? Yes. So I mentioned about the partitions. So first of all, have a look at the services that you're using in infrastructure as code and see if they are available. If you're making use of services that are not available, it's not going to run. The next thing is the partition is different. So if you've got any not hard coded, if you've got any like semi hard coded resource lookups, so if you've got like AWS :* as a resource lookup somewhere, that's going to break because the partition name is different. We've done quite a few projects in the past where we have got infrastructure as code running in US Gov Cloud and AWS China. And aside from sense checking the list of services, one thing that we've done is just run the infrastructure as code and just see what breaks, because there are some odd like little features that are missing, or the sort of toggles are a bit different. So those are my recommendations there. Next question on the list is: if we have a map agreement with AWS, will that cover us migrating some of our workloads to this region? So for those of you not familiar with this, MAP is Amazon's migration acceleration program. So if you're migrating workloads to AWS, you might sign one of these agreements and it gives you some commercial benefits, some discounts and so forth. I think I know enough about this to answer this question, but I will caveat it with: go speak to your AWS account manager if you're in this situation. So because the entity is, the billing entity is completely separate and you are being billed in euros, I do know that the map process for this region is different enough that I would suspect you would want to sign a new agreement. So if you're currently, let's say you're migrating workloads to Frankfurt and you decide actually you're going to switch it so that 25% of those are going to go to Brandenburg instead, I'd go to AWS and let them know that you are going to be running 25% of the workloads in this other region, because you'll want to sign a new map agreement to cover that, because the billing entity will be different as far as AWS is concerned. So do speak to your account manager on that. Next question here: does US Cloud Act override any operational sovereignty as in access, etc.? So I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to caveat this with my answer here. AWS have separated out the entity and have made promises around pledges around what they will do. One would hope that the US Cloud Act wouldn't be as far-reaching as to impact the German entity here. But again, I think if it was something you really needed to seriously consider, I would review what this looks like with a lawyer, and look at the risks again. This is all about risk management. So, what is the risk here? And sort of look over this with a lawyer. But there is still a connection back to the US entity. So there is still risk there that you need to consider. And one more question. I see that there's a few questions in the chat, so I will move over to the chat in a minute and see if there's anything else there. So the last question we have in the Q&A is, do you foresee any EU regulations asking for all financial critical market sectors to move to this? Really interesting question here. Personally, I think so. I think we're going to see increasingly critical things that are considered critical national infrastructure move in the direction, or at least the question being asked of, who controls the data, right? So that question asked at the very start, who controls the data here? What does the data, digital and operational sovereignty look like? And just making sure that there is a plan in place, or at least the risks are considered. Yeah, I think any kind of critical national infrastructure is definitely going to go through this. It's something on our radar. We've got customers asking us this question increasingly. And at the moment, we very much seem to be in the phase of understanding and asking questions and trying to sort of see where things go. So I do see us going in that direction, even if it is just asking the question and getting an understanding. Cool. Right, so that's all of the Q&A questions done. So let's have a quick scan of the chat. So Marco shared the list of the features that are available. Yeah, Dean made a good point here. I said about 10 to 15%, not being massive in the grand scheme, but if your existing AWS bill is 7-8 figures and you are thinking of moving all of that across to this region, then a 10 to 15% uplift is pretty considerable. Marco was talking about true digital sovereignty. Do you see AWS European Sovereign Cloud as true digital sovereignty? I don't know, a bit of a tricky question to answer here. I think I've already sort of touched on it in a roundabout way. There is still the connection back to the US entity, even if it's just the hardware and the software and the technology is leased back. So I don't know. It's in a much better place than just using the AWS commercial region, but I still think that connection back. Can you call it true digital sovereignty? I'm not too sure. I think it's open to interpretation and sort of reviewing a risk here. Another question from Dean: have we had any large EU government or regulated entities show interest in this? I think I touched on this earlier. People are asking questions about this. So at the moment, we haven't seen anybody make a wholesale move here, but a lot of people are considering options. So now that the platform's available, I think asking those questions about risk and what makes sense is coming up increasingly, but we haven't seen anybody move just of yet. For large EU-based companies, sovereignty only one aspect, cost control is another. Hyperscalers. Okay, I don't think that's a question. I think that's more of a point and opinion there, Dean. And then a question from Nick: are there any requirements for my organization to be an EU entity to work with EU SC? Good question. So I mentioned about, let's say you're building software and you're running it and you are selling that to entities that care about this. If you just run your software in that region, as I mentioned, you're going to have to do something similar to what Amazon has done, set up an entity in the EU, all of the staff based there, a degree of separation between that and the other entity, and then operate with that. If you've got an entity outside of the EU operating software in European Sovereign Cloud, you're not going to tick all of the boxes. On the flip side, let's say you are a provider of services to the customer, then you just need to very carefully consider the type of work that you're doing. If you're let's say you're just providing consultancy to that entity, like we would do, that would be absolutely fine. But if you were building and providing software to run there, then that's a different thing. So I think it depends on the nature of what your interaction is with the end customer there. Cool. I think I've covered all of the questions. Any last minute questions? Cool. I think that's it. If anybody does have any questions, I've got on a slide coming up, I've got some contact information. So as I said, this deck will be shared, so you get all of these links. But whilst it's up on the screen, here's a few QR codes. So we wrote a blog post on this, going into a little bit more detail. So if this is something you're keen on or interested in, bookmark that and have a read. The official AWS site, the landing page that I showed a screenshot of, aws.eu. And then the last thing on the list, which will go into a lot of what I talked about in more detail, there is a white paper providing an overview of AWS European Sovereign Cloud. But hopefully, today's content has given you a high-level view of this and sort of an understanding of whether this is something you need to consider or not going forward. But here's some more resources. And as always, feel free to keep in touch with me. Here's my details, LinkedIn. You can go to our website and get in touch with the team if you've got any interest in anything I've talked about today. And feel free to pop me an email if you've got any follow-on questions. But thank you very much, everybody, for dialing in today.